Good morning. My name is Cedric Thomas. I'm the CEO for W2, and we thought it'd be interesting to conclude this session on the industry of open source software by a look at the challenges that lie ahead. But before that, a quick word on W2. We are a non-profit open source organization founded in 2007. Our mission is to promote a code base of open source software. And this software is developed by a community of some 2,500 people and 30 legal entities that work in a collaborative way. And we are a totally independent organization because our members pay the fees. So let's have a look at the challenges that lie ahead for the open source ecosystem. There are challenges that comes from the technology evolution. We see three of them. There are challenges that are caused by the evolution of our behaviors, and there are challenges that relate to the structure of this industry. So the first challenge is that of uncontrolled reuse. A recent study by Sonatype has identified that some 80 to 90% of an application is composed of existing components. So it's composed of reusing existing components. So that does not go without any risks. And there are risks of importing vulnerabilities in the application, but also importing breach of license compliance and also importing changes in functionalities. So there are tools to manage this. It's a growing industry. The software composition analysis is more, I would say it's more an emerging industry. So that challenge is being tackled. The second challenge we see related to the technology is that of the evolution of software delivery from the code mode to service mode. That changes the value proposition. And especially from the standpoint of open source software, it means that when we had freedom in controlling the code, with the SaaS model, there is no freedom at all because we do not control the code. Access to the code is not part of the deal. All we have to do is consume a service and then pay the invoice. Another evolution that changes the role of the developers is that of the evolution towards machine learning programming. Artificial intelligence in programming changes the role of the developer to the extent that if in conventional programming the developer is key, in machine learning programming, it's the data that is key. So the expertise may lay, or the quality may lay with the programmer in the open source or conventional programming world, whereas it lies with the data and the data quality in the machine learning programming. Now we have three evolutions or three challenges that are related to a change in our behaviors or related to our behaviors. Now we have the well-known challenge of the free riders. It's connected to the story of the tragedy of the commons that is well known. It's a story by which a free resource is often overconsumed by the users to the point that they destroy it. We have a little bit of that in the open source world with passive users or users that behave like passive consumers, send requests to development teams, but do not contribute back. So it should be the role of the up-and-coming open source program offices that large organizations are implementing to make sure that the relations between organizations and the open source world are managed professionally and with a view to the sustainability of the software ecosystem. Then another challenge related to the way users or the companies are behaving is that of the long-term trends towards IT outsourcing. That outsourcing may bring some advantages to the users, but as far as open source is concerned, we lose the connection between the users and their own developers with the open source world. What happens here is that outsourcers do not have much incentive to contribute back to the open source world. What outsourcers want to do is deliver the business solution to their customers and send the invoices. So we lose the cultural aspect, we lose the relations between the open source developers and the actual business users. This challenge here, the sixth one, which are called deviations, is relatively new, and I see two kinds of deviations. The first one is that caused by the what I call opportunistic foundations that leverage the open source software or the legal construct of open source to collaboratively create technologies, but their interest is not at all in nurturing or supporting open source software, but really to create a technology that will grab a market share. So it's purely a business strategy and has not much to do with open source software. The second deviation comes from a new trend, a recent trend, to look for licenses that can control how the code is used. So, of course, that was caused by some abuse from the cloud service providers, but we don't think that controlling the usage of software is within the remit of what open source is about. Now we have challenges that are related to the structure of the industry. The graph you see here shows the relative weight or influence of the four key global regions in this newly emerging platform economy or the market for platforms. What it shows here is that Europe is only a marginal player. And the problem we're facing is that open source, being an avatar of the whole IT industry, the relation we see here is also the relations we have in the open source world. Whereas Europe is not a leading region, so we really need to tackle this challenge. Otherwise, we will not be in a position to control the evolutions of our own open source ecosystems. Another challenge related to the change in structure of our environment is the trend towards IoT and verticalization. Traditionally, open source comes from middleware and tools that can be used in any kind of context. With IoT and verticalization, what's happening, it's some fragmentation of the market, where the applications or the code or the software that is developed is really dependent on the specifics of some industries, business processes, or some hardware, even in the case of open hardware, and that reduces the possibilities for mutualization. So we think this fragmentation is taking open source software outside of its comfort zone. And then we have this question of the structure of the industry, where what we see is the growth or the growing influence of the leading IT players into our own industry. So these leading IT players maybe are keystone players in the ecosystem. Some are in several ecosystems. Some can become very influential. So there is a whole hierarchy of influence and market powers that needs to be not controlled, but at least watched. And it may be that some have an overpowering influence on the evolution of the open source environment or the open source ecosystem. And the last challenge comes from the fact that we tend to say that open source has won, open source has become mainstream, Well, it's not really the case. If you look at these recent market evaluations, open source software only represents, well, let's say between 10 and 15% of the IT market, which is really, it's not, it's very important, but in fact it's marginal. And what we hear from that, from what we see in this graph, is that the real power of influence does not lie with the open source vendors, although they may be influential, but the real market power still is with the proprietary side of the IT industry. So here we are, 10 key challenges. They're not lethal, but we need to be careful how we manage the evolution of our open source ecosystem. Thank you.